I've come back to southern Germany and Bavaria to tell the story of the more occult, esoteric roots of the Nazi Party. Now, I don't want to get into the whole History Channel Ancient Aliens thing, but this is an interesting place to start with the Thule Society. Now, don't let the Discovery Channel fool you. The Thule Society was a real thing, but it wasn't associated with ancient aliens. Really, what it was a bunch of upper middle class German semi-aristocratic families that were advocating for an esoteric type of German nationalism. They called it Volkisch nationalism. And from their headquarters in this hotel, they pushed this idea. They pushed the ideas of a prophet that would lead the German people to glory, of a holy war of blood and soil. And it was here, and I guarantee you none of the people walking in know this, that in 1918 there was a battle. Basically, the Thule Society thought that they would be able to take over the fledgling People's State of Bavaria, which was already an illegal revolutionary government. And so the government, which was a student group basically which had usurped control from the monarchy, declared that they were all enemies of the state, and they broke into the building and promptly executed them. And this created a minor uproar in Europe because some of these guys were relatives of monarchies throughout Europe. And a close associate of the society was a man named Dietrich Eckhart. And Eckhart was one of those poets. He wasn't a member of the society, but he was a poet that was obsessed with this new play called Peer Gynt. And he identified Peer Gynt as because in the poem, Peer Gynt was a Norwegian folk hero. He was a giant who killed many, many, many trolls. He almost rid the world of trolls, but eventually he was defeated and returned to his village brokenhearted. He said that there was going to be a German soul, a German prophet that would come along and lead his people. He was searching for this guy, and he basically took Hitler under his wing for a while and groomed him in front of the Thule Society, of which many of their members were early influential members of the Nazi Party. It's unknown if Hitler was a member, but it is absolutely positively known that Eckhart really groomed him and taught him public speaking. And he proposed to Hitler, why don't you basically take on the role of Peer Gynt? And he eventually had to go and say, hey, the point isn't to die in glory. The point is to pick up where Peer Gynt kind of left off and not become a martyr to continue your goal. But at the same time, Eckhart didn't believe that the light of their evil Nazi party could survive without the darkness of the Jewish race. So he had a very weird kind of cult mentality, but he did write his own version of Peer Gynt, which is shown on the screen now, and his own interpretation of it, which he believed he identified strongly with the Thule Society. Now we're here at Kurt Eisner's assassination spot. And what you need to know is that in the chaos after World War I, there was an attempt to establish a Bavarian people's state. And this lasted for a very short period of time because it was a cult. They did things like, declare war on Switzerland because they wouldn't give them 18 locomotives, and they wrote the Vatican to say, hey, you left the keys here in Munich for the toilet, come pick them up. And he was killed by a guy named Arco Valli after being rejected from the Thule Society. Valli was a far right-wing German nationalist. He was a Volkisch guy, and the Thule Society said, oh, we like your nationalism, you're part Jewish. And so he killed Eisner, the leader of this revolutionary group, who basically was replaced by a Soviet republic. He was replaced by a Russian immigrant who was ousted from the Russian Civil War and found himself among a large community of communist exiles in Munich. And they established a very short-lived Soviet republic. It was almost successful because the Soviets were pushing through Poland. If they would have made it, Germany would have become a Soviet state. And we're here driving along the Austrian border again, which has to do with the conflict with nationalism, because when Austria-Hungary split, the Germans wanted Austria to be a part of them. But in reality, it became independent, and the countries became flooded with Hungarians, which they viewed with contempt. They didn't like the Slavic people. They viewed them as ethnic outsiders to their greater German state. And this is the sort of mindset that a lot of these evil nationalist guys were raised in. And we're nearing a cemetery now where it's buried Anton Drexler. And it has to be remembered that Hitler didn't create the Nazi Party. Hitler usurped Anton Drexler, who was the creator of a party called the German Workers' Party. And Hitler joined it because he was requested to by the army. They said, inform on them, we think they're communists, and if they are, we'll crack down on them. Well, quickly, Hitler was elected a member of it. He was given the membership number of 50, even though there were probably many fewer members. And quickly he assumed control. And it's interesting to note that he rejected the name National Socialist German Workers' Party, but it went anyway because he was a lower-ranking member at the time and didn't have total control. And this is Drexler's grave, which is now wood. But behind me here is Hof Brewhouse, which is, as I said earlier, when the communists took over, it was the headquarters for the communist government. But they were kind of just a free love, freewheeling kind of student group that somehow in the chaos of World War I managed to seize control and overthrow the monarchy in Munich and establish their own state. It was on the second floor here that the National Socialist German Workers' Party held their first meeting. And they also had a bunch of brawls with the communists. And in fact, the SA, the predecessor to the SS, was established on this floor of Hof Brewhouse. And it was just a pool for revolutionary activity. Vladimir Lenin ate here. And if you look on the ceilings, you can see these used to be swastikas. They were painted over by the Bavarian flag because they couldn't, whitewash it. You would still see something from underneath it. And it's a symbol of the culture of Munich. It's very much really symbolic of the city, and it's a popular tourist attraction. Really, really do tend to hardcore downplay the historic kind of connections because they don't want all of those war tourists that kind of glorify it like they do and Braunau am in for Hitler's house and the birth, of their hero.
Behind me here is the grave of Andreas Bornedel. Bornedel himself served in the fields of World War I and came back from the war disillusioned with politics. In the years before, in 1919, Bavaria had split off into the Bavarian People's Republic. Following that, the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Both of these were put down by units of Freikorps and disillusioned military men who'd returned from the battlefields. Bornedel and many others started joining these right-wing groups. Eventually, Bornedel found himself in 1923 wrapped up in something called the Beer Hall Push. This was a movement by Ludendorff, Hitler, and a number of other generals to take the government of Germany by force and enact their program of National Socialism. Bornedel was killed during this. They attempted to take the first beer hall, weren't successful, and tried to march onto the main government building here in Munich. When they tried to do this, they locked arms and started walking towards the police, and the police then opened fire. A shot hit Bornedel in the abdomen. When it hit Bornedel in the abdomen, he fell over, and it was a mortal wound, but he bled on the Nazi flag. This Nazi flag was spirited off by another member of the SA, or another member of the troop, and basically returned to the Nazi organization in 1926. And what's interesting about its return is that it went to the SS, not the SA. The SS only became a large organization quite a number of years later, but it shows that very early in this movement, the SS was a small, dependable circle of people. A group of people behind closed doors that operated in secret, almost unknown to the rest of the SA, who they would eventually later wipe out. And Bornedel himself was interred along with another good number of people who died in this initial confrontation at something called, well, it was the so-called Honor Temple in Munich. After the Allies took over, they dismantled the Honor Temple and they left the base of it because it was an unusual habitat for another number of unusual plant life organisms. But it was overgrown, and it remains so to this day, and it's hard to find it unless you know the actual GPS coordinates. After the war, they sent these bodies to various cemeteries, and it's hard to track them down. A lot of them, the families didn't want to reclaim them, and they kind of just ended up cremating them or burying over them. Another couple of them, like Andrea Bornedel, came to be interred in cemeteries like this one. What's unusual about Bornedel is that the blood that stained the flag that came from Bornedel actually was used in the most, I would call it the most sacred symbol of the regime from 1933 to 1945. This flag became their icon. They stored it in their brown house. In order to consecrate any other flag, they had to touch it to the blood flag or the Blutfahne, and this was guarded at all times by a special honor guard, and only a single member of the SS, a man named Jacob Grimminger, whose grave is now lost. They buried over him, and the flag was lost after the war. Nobody knows what happened to it. Now, Andrea Bornedel is simply just buried in his family's plot. There's no special monument to honor specifically what he did, and I think that might be for the best.
Now we're looking on Ferdinand Hall, which is where, when the beer hall putsch was moving forward, their initial goal was kind of just to seize control of the beer hall, but they realized that some of the leaders kind of left. And they pushed forward to try to take over the Weimar Republic government building on the basically just to the right of the open plaza, viewed from the top of this kind of ancient archway. They confronted the police here. There was a police barricade, and the police aimed their rifles, and they kind of locked arms and just marched towards them. And here's actually Hitler in 1914 watching his speech. It's one of the earliest known photos of him. And the police shot and killed 16 of them. And it was at this hall that they actually hung one of the first Nazi flags over a government building, the Town Hall of Munich. And you can see on the left is the Nazi flag, and on the right is the Hitler Youth flag. But nowadays, the only thing commemorating it is this plaque right here. Police officers died fighting against the Nazis, but it became immediately the place where the blood was first spilled in their quote-unquote revolution of blood. So it became a place where the SS was kind of, honorifically inaugurated into their post. It was a place where they graduated their training academy, and they went there, or at least the most expected of them. And here behind it is Shirker's Path, because as you pass by this one Ferdinand Hall area, you were expected to give the Nazi salute. A lot of people just realized, I'm just going to walk around it. But what's fascinating here is this is the spiritual heart of the Nazi movement. This is where their blood was first shed. But if you look behind it, this is the building of the Munich University, where the brother and sister of the White Rose movement, really, Hans and Sophie Scholl, it was this balcony that they threw their pamphlets off of. And it was such bravery that they basically committed this act that was punishable by execution, and they were both beheaded. They managed to do this right underneath the noses of German authorities. And these are some of their pamphlets, but essentially they were ratted out by a janitor who saw them. And after the war, the janitor was given a trial, and he said, I don't even oppose them politically. I was just following my orders. He didn't even realize what would happen to the students. He was heartbroken, according to him, that the students died. But this is a little-known but very powerful, I think, memorial to they threw the papers off right from here, and the guard saw Sophie throwing the papers. And here, adjacent to what was the Museum of Degenerate Art, was the White Rose, and Hans Scholl led it after he became disillusioned as a member of the Hitler Youth, because he viewed himself as a German patriot, and he viewed himself as a German nationalist. He saw this group basically just committing these mass genocidal actions, and it was at the universities, part of the Nazi movement, because Nazism was a very intellectual movement at the time, that he decided to conduct this sort of resistance, nonviolent resistance. But here at Karl-Lindenplatz, the America House, and Karl-Lindenplatz was the headquarters of most of the Nazi Party offices, right down the road from the temple that they built to honor the 16 people who died in the beer hall putsch. And America House was erected after World War II, right in their marching ground, right in the Nazi Party marching ground, to be an outreach program, to sort of reach out and say, hey, America's not so bad. Come in here, learn about our news, and learn about our culture, and we'll kind of de-escalate things. And it was a lot of the America houses, because they constructed them throughout Germany, that anti-Vietnam protests were happening. And down this road, you can see from this pillar Brown House, and you can see where the right here, left and right, the temples to honor the 16 who died in the putsch were. And on both sides, and even behind the camera here, you had a number of German government buildings, and also just a number of propaganda buildings. They existed basically for people to march in front of them, for, just to look good, I guess, and to market that across the world. And they thought that it would be propaganda that would convince people to their cause. But even today, it's very useful for protests. A lot of people like to meet there because it's a very pretty public and open space. And we can see here one of their reels. These guys are marching right over to the Honor Temple. But right now, there's a protest of artists who, because of COVID, are now finding themselves out of money without much help from the government. And these guys are all kind of just walking around doing their own thing. But this temple was destroyed after the war, and they wanted to completely erase its existence. You see the woman walking in front of it now. They wanted to totally wipe it out. But they found that after a few years of it being kind of derelict and abandoned, that a number of interesting plants had grown in it, and it provided a good space for some weird kind of, unusual and endangered organisms, and they found it best to just leave it be. And you can imagine, I mean, Adolf Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, they all marched up and down these steps laying wreaths. And basically, as far as I can understand, anybody who wanted to could go up in here and lay a wreath or say whatever kind of weird pagan prayer they were thinking. And we have footage here. They would reenact it every year, and it would be a huge, enormous televised parade. And you can see the coffins here of the 16 men who died, and they're all wearing the original uniform, not the SS, but the SA uniform, because it was the SA and just the random supporters on the street. And right now it's mainly used as a bike stop, but if you look over here, this is where Brown House used to be. And Brown House was where they would kind of basically display all of the main relics of the Nazi regime. And Brown House was where they kept the blood flag, which I already talked a little bit about. And now it has become the Museum of National Socialist Documentation. They document the war crimes that were committed in World War II, and they make it publicly known because they really don't want anybody questioning, oh, did this many really die? And here is Obersalzberg, and I'm walking up the hill to a place called Kamphausel. Basically, as the push failed, he was put in jail. And it lasted because he had good connections, and the judge was sympathetic to his cause. He was eventually released to family property in Obersalzberg, and he came to a little remote cabin in the forest, and it's no longer there, but the base is. And he decided to basically, well, the propaganda was that he wrote Mein Kampf here. Other people helped him write it, but obviously you need a picturesque German mountain for some Volkisch kind of propaganda tool. And if you look around, there's actually a lot of original gravel here, and in the back there's an SS guard hut, because it was a place that they considered sacred, because they were a religion of basically ancestor worship and cult worship of their leader. They guarded it around the clock and made sure it was safe and protected. But after the war, American and Allied soldiers blew it up. They put explosives in it and lit them off. And this is the grave of Ernst Röhm. So basically, Röhm was the leader of the SA, and he was one of the most influential people in the beer hall push. He was training these guys in warfare, but he was more of a working class revolutionary. And he was also inconvenient because he was a homosexual, and at the time, even left-wing groups were kind of laughing. They called him Hitler's homosexual. And when the Night of the Long Knives came along, Rome really wanted to be a part of the regular army, but Hitler viewed them as like, you're expendable and you're not disciplined enough. And when Rome kept insisting, Hitler basically claimed that he was planning a coup, which he wasn't. He massacred hundreds of people. But anyway, this is the Schelling Salon. There's a couple of interesting conspiracy theories online that Hitler and Lenin had tea here, but I don't believe it. I've looked into it. There's nothing to support it. Right along the edge of the road here is 50 Schellingstrasse. And this is actually a photography studio because they realized the benefit of propaganda right away, where Hitler met Eva Braun, which would become his wife. And for a while, he didn't actually marry her because he thought that he was incredibly attractive. That if he was married, he would lose a lot of his sex appeal, which, yeah, I can't see it. And this is one of the few eagles left, and it was one of their headquarters for a short period of time in the very earliest days of the movement. And obviously now these plaques and flags are gone, but this is the view here from Obersalzberg. Like I said, he did go to Obersalzberg, but after he gained control of the government, he constructed a gigantic house, and the Allied army destroyed it entirely. They had the Obersalzberg, it's now a restaurant up on Eagle's Nest, but he hated this. He said it was tacky and gaudy, and he just didn't like it. But what he did have was a house that was kind of gigantic that he really loved. It was made mostly out of concrete that overlooked the valley here. And it's also just about maybe 500 yards away from Kamphausel. It was on his family's property, or it was on property adjacent to his family's property. came here as a retreat, and it was basically where he ran his government from. And you can see bits of concrete everywhere because the Allies just blew it to smithereens. There's nothing left of it except for the shell in the basement. And as we walk up the hill, you'll get a good glimpse of that pretty soon. Yeah, it was interesting reading. I read Pilgrimage by Savitri Devi, and I see a lot of people commenting on her videos online, being like, "Oh, a true awakened woman." I've read her book, and it's ridiculous. She was telling somebody after her she visited Germany to go see the sites associated with Hitler, who she viewed as a reincarnated diva from an Aryan culture in India. Somebody told her, "Oh, I was in the camps. Would you like to see them?" And she basically just called him gay, and he stammered at her. He's like, "What?" And she's like, "Oh, I have defeated him in debate." And she just smirked at him, and he just left the train, and she just kind of held her head triumphantly as if she'd won. But this place was destroyed to keep creeps like her from sort of deifying it, because there were people who did these pilgrimages all over these places without the purpose of giving any historical context. Obviously, they did them to propagandize it and to feel good about their personal belief. But anyway, this is the Museum of Degenerate Art. And I've heard it said that some people like Nazi art because it looks very realistic, but their art is very plastic. And their art is done only to say, "Oh, we can make this art because we're pure," and it's not done for the sake of artwork. It's done for the sake of a message. And they basically went around the country and stole art from people who had a message and gave it silly labels, just insulting, and hung it up crookedly, and it was just an insult to everybody involved. And of course, a lot of times those artists would later be thrown in the camps or imprisoned, and a lot of times it was from Jewish artists or black artists, people who they wanted to portray. It's like, "Oh, this is the inside of the mind of a Jew." But anyway, here's the 1937. This was an SS guard hut that it was over the river, and it led up to the Obersalzberg house, the Struggle house or Kampfhausel, and a couple of the houses associated with some of these leaders. Albert Speer is actually just a quarter mile up this road, and as you go up further, you also get to Eagle's Nest. And I think it's a very, very beautiful river, and it keeps flowing regardless of what happens over the top of it. And I kind of like that. I'm going for eons. Anyway, we are heading on up here now to, I'm driving up at this point to Obersalzberg and Kampfhausel. At the time, Austria was kind of off limits because of the whole virus thing going on, and I didn't want to enter to see Eagle's Nest. Plus, I've already seen that before. So up here is the home of Albert Speer, which I'll show in a minute. But what's important to know about this area of Obersalzberg is that it was thought to be a basically it was going to be a national redoubt. They were going to move all of their most elite soldiers to this point and fight once the war was basically losing in their favor. But Hitler didn't think that that was good to plan for, and he basically waited until the last man and ordered everybody to just kind of go their own way and riffraff, and didn't have any plans at all. And anybody who tried to go was met with immediate threats of execution. And this was the home of Alfred or Wilhelm Keitel. Rather, he was the chief of the Armed Forces High Command, basically the highest military person in Nazi Germany, outside of politics, that is. And over here is Alfred Jodl, who was the commander of the Wehrmacht. And they both had their houses very close to, well, I mean, obviously this was a village for very high-ranking people. Everybody that lived here would have been important, sort of an inner circle type member, and they would have not associated with the riffraff of regular Germany, and they viewed themselves as much higher than regular Germans. And right across the street was one of their army headquarters, which was used by the U.S. Army after we had conquered them, and eventually given back. And I believe now it's a private hotel, but they left this as a symbol of, like, remember what we conquered here. Remember that this used to be a thing. And the mountains in the background are very beautiful. And it was made basically just for paintings. They made these with the idea of aesthetics in mind, and it was a setting where all of these high-ranking officers would go around and isolate themselves from the reality of what was happening on the ground. A lot of them didn't want to be associated with what was really going on, if not in Germany, especially on the Eastern Front. This is the home of Albert Speer, who was the minister of armaments production, and he was involved, of course, with projects like the V-2 rocket, which used slave labor, and just a lot of slave labor projects. He got off basically scot free. He did jail for quite a while.
I was there in Hitler's house in Berchtesgaden, it's a Berghof, and the adjutants of Hess were waiting outside in the anteroom. And then after a short time they were asked by Martin Bormann to come in to Hitler. And just a few seconds afterwards I heard an animal cry, I only can say. And it was Hitler, and after that was really a row of disturbance in the house, and it were shouting around, where is Göring, where is Goebbels, and give me a phone call with the air ministry, and so on and so on. And I don't think that this was just some fake, that it made acting for whom? Because nobody was there except 2 or 3 of the people who were living on the Berghof.
And we're here back in Obersalzberg to see another grave in the same section where Ernst Röhm is buried. And his name was Hans Lahmers. And Lahmers was what you might call a agent of the German deep state. And Lahmers basically began as a politician soon after the Nazi rise to power, and he took posts and immediately climbed the ladder very, very quickly. He was good at what he did. And he took a post as sort of a council of 6 and then a council of 3, and more he would control more and more from the head of the Reich Chancellery and remain operating kind of behind the curtain. And eventually Himmler and Rosenberg and all of these leaders of the Nazi Party viewed Lahmers as a direct threat to them, because the paper, before it reached anybody, would always go to Lahmers' desk. Lahmers himself was arrested and not really executed. I believe he committed suicide. And in the corner here is the grave of Friedrich. In the corner here is the grave of Friedrich Timm, author and a social progressive, and actually resisted the rise to power of Nazi Germany through nonviolent methods. And he died, thankfully, before he saw them invade Poland. And here we have the camp at Landsberg. And the camp at Landsberg is kind of overshadowed because you have a lot of people visiting Landsberg am Lech. Landsberg am Lech is, of course, the place where Hitler went to prison after the Beer Hall Putsch, but people forget that right down the road from there, you have this concentration camp, which was a satellite camp of Dachau. And when you read what they were doing with the death marks and to just eradicate the Jews when they realized they were losing, it really begins to become clear how just chaotic the last days of the war were. They ordered the Luftwaffe to bomb them. The Luftwaffe basically said no. Then they ordered them just off in trains to the Alps to be killed in, quote, one way or another. But tens of thousands of people died here. And the village of Landsberg is also known for being some of the most horrific executions, or executing some of the most horrific war criminals. They called him Bluebeard, and he was the chief of the Ahnenerbe. And it shows the level that sort of Nazi occultism goes. And this guy, the Nazi Bluebeard, he was the creator of a group called the Ferdinand Hall Society, or something along those lines. And he believed that there was an energy path crossing underneath this. And he believed that it would imbue the German people with power, and it was the center of their universe. He was active in doing all of these weird sort of experiments on, of course, Jewish prisoners when he met Himmler, who made him immediate chief of the Ahnenerbe. And the Ahnenerbe were those guys, real Indiana Jones characters, who took trips to Iceland and Peru and Tibet and found this bogus evidence of an ancient Germanic culture in all of those places, basically simply because they used the swastika, and also they have myths and legends of blonde-haired, blue-eyed men. But many of the people buried here were They have no names on their gravestones now, but they were members of the Ahnenerbe or doctors, and they were executed following the doctor's trial, symbolically in the same prison where Hitler was imprisoned after the beer hall. Again, here we're driving to Obersalzberg through the mountains near Austria, and we are going to kind of just explore around a little bit. And yeah, back at the cemetery where a lot of other famous people are buried, you have these men along the wall in Obersalzberg. You can see that a lot of them died at the very end of the war. A lot of them died in the Battle of Berlin, like on the day of the Russians moving into Berlin. And I noticed a lot of these guys looked my age. It was very sad to see. And a lot of them just got wrapped up. They were regular army guys who were conscripted. And I'm surprised to see that their logos, their swastikas haven't been scratched out, all of them, because that's illegal in Germany. You can see a lot of them are listed uh, missing in East Prussia, which is now a part of Königsberg. It's Russia, and the Caucasus, like Georgia, Armenia. You have Berlin. This one was the final day of the war. And just down the road from there, we have some SS barracks, and this was in what was supposed to be, as I mentioned before, the sort of outpost, the last outpost. And you have here actually the cylindrical tower. It's called the redoubt. So not only was this territory supposed to be the final holdout, they even had final holdouts for the final holdout. But the main thing was Hitler didn't believe they were going to lose, and they believed that any thought of like moving troops towards Bavaria would be seen as defeatism. And he truly believed, as Berlin was being shelled, that they would just stop. And so anybody who went down there, including Lahmers and including the leader of the Nazi Party, they were both declared enemies of the state and ordered with execution. And they weren't executed, but they narrowly escaped that. But as we drive down the road a little bit, we see the kind of planned community that exists here. And they wanted this for only the whitest of the white, wanted this to be their sort of mecca. And of course, because these societies would be strictly structured, you wouldn't be able to visit here if you weren't high ranking or the blondest haired, bluest eyed, and it was also sort of like a pilgrimage spot. As we go down the road, this is a youth hostel that would have been used for members of Hitler Jugend, and it was extensively renovated in recent years. But straight ahead, you can actually still see the gun posts in the corner of it, and it was. I'll include some of the designs for it as it originally looked, because you can still see how it was. But I believe they recently knocked out the guard posts in the wall, and of course the flag is down, obviously now. But you can see how it looked back then versus how it looks today, and it looks pretty similar. And here are some of the scenic mountains in the background. They believe that this would instill the youth and instill the SS with sort of national pride. And some of the commanders and high-ranking officers would have these homes overlooking the community to sort of watch their little worker ants move as if they were the overlords of the city. And you can really see how they wanted to structure their living areas just like this. And here we are at one of the scarier places. This is the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry, and it was very closely tied to the West. It's a branch of the Berlin Institute by the same name, and it was given a lot of money by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, obviously, the Institute has a different name now, but back in the day, these were the guys who hired Josef Mengele to study eye colors, and he would basically dye these eyes by injecting them with coloring and then cut them out and send the samples back packed to boards like butterflies. The same institute sterilized 600 Africans living along the French border. They called them Rhineland bastards, and it was very, very important to their ideas of eugenics and phrenology, and everybody knew they were kind of screwed. So when the Allies advanced on this, the director of the institute killed himself. Mengele went into hiding and he escaped years later, but they all knew that they were screwed. But for some reason, the pharmaceutical companies would pay them the equivalent of like, what, $20, $30 per inmate nowadays? They basically got off scot-free. they got away with everything they did, and now they're still around. Now, Bayer is one of the biggest ones, but they also had a company called Ig Farben, which was a chemical company that was just testing on inmates. And they would be like, what happens if you inject them with our new product? How much can they take? And then the Nazis would come back and openly say 80 out of 90 died. And they'd be like, all right, test another 200. And none of the people on those boards of directors ever faced any justice, as far as I know. Of course, the German ones may have, but the ones that came from the Rockefeller Foundation, the ones that came from the West, they all faced that. And in fact, the heads of this university, a lot of them had attended the eugenics conference in London just a couple of years before the start of the war and the Nazi rise to power. So it would have been very easy, and it's very uneasy to think about, maybe Britain, maybe France would have just jumped on board with these ideas. I can see it happening. And in that parallel reality, I don't think I would want to be in that parallel reality. But it's a very scary thought to have, I think. And nowadays, this is a technical university.
Next to me is the grave of Dr. Otto Bradfish. How this man managed to escape justice is beyond me, but he was the commander of Einsatzgruppe B. So Einsatzgruppe was a earlier part of World War II that a lot of people don't really talk about. Most people, especially Americans, tend to think that the Holocaust was Auschwitz and Dachau and these gas chambers, but in reality, during Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis sent in people behind enemy lines to clear everything. And part of this was Einsatzgruppen. Einsatzgruppen was not a regular unit of army. It was a unit of people who were willing to kill indiscriminately. Any members of it started with communists, snipers, guerrillas, and then it went to anything that was considered a racially wrong element. Otto Bradfish commanded a unit of 60 to 80 men. He commanded them, I believe, across southern Ukraine. And their orders were to massacre anybody. Oh no, it was Belarus. He was in Belarus. Some of the most brutal fighting in World War II. If you would like to see more about it, I would recommend watching the movie Come and See. Fantastic movie. And Otto Bradfish managed to make it back to Germany after the war. He killed 2,000 people in Minsk, 1,200 in Bialystok, thousands of others, just with his unit of 80 men. So he must have been doing a lot of these himself. And he made it back, and he was given, in the 1960s, after living under an assumed name and doing farm work for a period of time, similar to Joseph Mengele, he finally was caught, and he was given 4 years in prison. About 1 hour for every of the 37,000 Jewish people that he killed in Belarus. This was a part of the Nazi policy of completely and totally cleansing all of Belarus and making Lebensraum, or living area. And he died in 1994, a free man, the same year I was born.
This is a monument for Bavarian police officers who were killed in the line of duty. Of course, the date for their beginning of their commemoration is just after World War II, and I knew looking here that I would see the name of some of them who were killed in the Munich massacre of 1972. It was the Summer Olympics, and a Palestinian group called Black September assisted in killing a number of Israeli athletes, and they were assisted with material support by West German neo-Nazis. Strangely, they demanded the release of Bader and Meinhof, the leader of the Red Army faction, and this was all kind of planned together. It was very, very strange how it played out. All of the Black September guys died, as well as all of the athletes. And here now we're looking at where the men from Nuremberg trials were cremated, all of the war criminals. This home beside me was the home of a influential jeweler for World War II. He immigrated to Western Europe or to the United States. He left as a refugee and was used as an outpost during the war. Well, after the war, it was used as a convenient spot for the United States Army. And when they executed these war criminals at Nuremberg, they cremated them at the Eastern Cemetery in Munich, telling them that they were the crew of a regular German airplane that was shot down and giving them fake names. And they brought a number of urns filled with their ashes over to the house, stayed overnight, and then in the morning, they walked them down this boardwalk and scattered their ashes on the closest bridge over the river Isar. Now, from what I understand, it might not have been actually into the river beyond here. It was possibly, if not probably, this stream that goes right under the river. And this is where the architect of the Holocaust and the Nazi ideologue Rosenberg was burned and his ashes scattered. This was where all of some of the main guys I've been talking about throughout this episode, all of the men who were executed at Nuremberg as the main trial were scattered here through this little river. And it's very interesting. You can watch the Mark Shelton Productions video on it, but I really enjoy his production style, his videos, and the river itself is very still, very pretty just to look at, and you would never know the evil history that's probably still floating around in there somewhere. And this city is the headquarters of a mysterious group called Stille Hilfe, or Silent Help. And Stille Hilfe was created, unlike other groups which were legitimate in helping the Wehrmacht. Stille Hilfe was created specifically to help the SS, the most evil members and war criminals, escape. I believe they helped some of the architects of the Holocaust, including Adolf Eichmann, escape. They were probably involved with Josef Mengele, and they're headquartered in this home right here, right down from the church. And it's a non-registered charity, so anybody who donates, they don't know where that donation is going, but it is known that they send off money and they are still active and they still make thousands of dollars a year. Presumably they send the money to a Protestant nursing home somewhere in Bavaria. They also have been known to send it off to people still living in South America, as well as for the maintenance of SS graves in Eastern Europe. And it's strange to think of the mysterious history behind those closed doors.